Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode on the Teams for Business podcast. I'm your host, Jack.
I'm Ivan.
I'm Kylan.
And I'm Jackie.
Today we'll be discussing the semiconductor and the chip industry more in general than we did in episode 43, in which we focused on NVIDIA. So just to start off with the general question, what do you guys know about the semiconductor slash chip industry? What are some major players in this industry?
I guess I can start off. So I remember last time we talked about, NVIDIA, for the focus on NVIDIA, but with the semiconductor industry in general, it's a very important industry. Obviously, like just like NVIDIA, there are other companies such as like Intel, AMD, and sometimes even Apple, and these players produce a lot of different kind of chips, like NVIDIA with their GPUs, but Intel also has mainly their CPUs, and AMD with their CPUs and GPUs, etc. And there's also like memory chips and then other computer components, such as like RAM or hard drives, SSDs made by companies such as like Samsung. And this is just like a very big industry because as the internet kind of expands and grows, we need these devices to connect to the internet and use the internet. And I think sometimes it's overlooked, but there's also companies such as like Qualcomm and Broadcom. They are producers of chips that are used in phones, especially they're in contracts with companies like Apple to build the chips for their phones. And then Qualcomm also produces, I think, chips for Samsung, and then like OnePlus, all the other really big phone producers, they also produce the chips for them. So even though like chips, you might think it's only computers, but it's important to remember that phones are also computers.
Yeah, I think that the semiconductor industry obviously is very big, but it's kind of made up of like designing, manufacturing, and also like distribution. So in terms of like manufacturing, I think that like of course NVIDIA and Intel, as well as like AMD, kind of like they're focusing more on CPUs and GPUs. These companies are obviously very big. I think they're some of the major players, but there's also companies like even like Samsung and Texas Instruments that also like kind of build specific semiconductor companies based on a specific market. Like Texas Instruments, like they design processors for automotive and industrial, different like different specific like application specific designs for these semiconductors. So obviously this is a very large industry that there's more growth to be had as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And so while Ivan and Kaiwan gave a really good like current introduction of what's happening, I can talk a little bit about like the history of the semiconductor industry. So if you really think about it, like technology, like as like what we think of as technology right now, it only kind of exploded within the last decade or so. And so like if we look at some of the trends, like right now there's like obviously a lot of companies in this industry, but like obviously we know like the big players, so like Samsung, Intel, Nvidia, things like that. AMD also is up there. But then if we look at like towards like 1975-ish, there were only like three players, like TI, Motorola, and Philips. Like I'm looking at this like spreadsheet that we made for like data, and like there was only three companies like in the 1975 era. So like that kind of just shows like the growth. Like now if you were to make a list, like it probably would be so much more than just like top 10. Like there would be a lot more. But then back then there was only like three top companies. And then like to look at also like there's some of their sales, like right now, it's a lot. So right now it's in like the hundreds of billions. But then if you look back at like even 2013, which was only a decade ago, like the revenue for this industry, like the annual semiconductor sale was like half of what it is now. And that kind of just shows like this shift towards technology and like the shift towards making it bigger and like using it so much more now than like what it was 10 years ago. It's like that's just like the stuff I find really interesting, that you can like kind of see in real time how an industry is growing and how like all of these different parts, because like for chips, like no one's just like buying a chip to buy a chip, right? Like it's used in like another product, and so you kind of can see like how that's like all rising together.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely agree with everything that's been said. We can definitely, chips are a big part of like any electronics, not just like computers with their CPUs and GPUs, and not only those like processing systems for TVs, phones. Chips are always like a part of that. So we can just know that the chips have like very like wide applications they are also like a very crucial part of what we do today. Also, just to bounce off of Jackie's point, we can definitely see how like the chip industry has grown over the and has sort of represented the growth in technology. Like we had this huge technology boom in the last decade or so, and then that's definitely correlated with the growth of the chip industry because so many of these electronics and technology that is currently developed needs some sort of like chip. Like some most computers use CPUs. Recently, a lot of the AI developments are using GPUs. A lot of things have memory chips and like processing chips there. And it's just a very wide industry that can be applied to different and very wide like applications. And I know Kyvan started to talk a little bit about the growth. So what do you guys think about how the semiconductor industry slash chip industry will potentially grow in the future?
I mean, so the obvious answer would kind of be major players with artificial intelligence and machine learning because that's what these chips are mainly being used today, and that's why these stocks are growing so much in the past few years. Is because all these companies are investing a lot into AI and that require a lot of processing power, and these semiconductor and chip manufacturers are manufacturing more new chips that will be used towards this growth with AI. And even though AI will be a really big player, I think another big player would be the expansion of computational power, especially research into quantum computing. Like even though it's not necessarily like quantum computing isn't kind of the same as like what the computing we see is today, and not necessarily a direct link to the semiconductor industry, but I feel like the semiconductor and chip manufacturers will look towards researching how to stay in the game in the long term. And in the long term, it's definitely going to be quantum computing because that's where the computational power is, and that will lead to more discoveries, making making discoveries that will probably possibly change the way we live.
Yeah, I definitely agree as well. I just think that there's so much room to grow in this industry, especially because of a lot of the stuff that's tied to AI and how much like AI that we're currently using as well. And I just think that with the world being so centered around electronics, the semiconductor is just going to be able to fuel that growth as well. I just think that with the increased adoption of electronic devices, there's going to be places where even like places that don't have access to electronics, it's going to get access in the future. And along with that, the semiconductor industry is only going to go up as well. Like we mentioned, kind of like, although there is like a potential market domination of the GPU industry by NVIDIA, I still think that this industry is characterized by competition and innovation, and there's going to be many different companies that want to get into this industry just because it is so lucrative in the future. I think that there's going to be a lot of competition, so this isn't necessarily something that we have to worry too much about right now and for the future.
Yeah, to take this on from a little bit different of a perspective, like I definitely do agree that in the future there's going to be like it's still going to expand, it's going to keep expanding. Like we're only seeing like increased uses for like semiconductors, so definitely that field in itself is going to expand. But I think like also in the future we'll see kind of more adjacent fields. One example of that would be like sustainability and semiconductors. So like if you think of it, environmental issues is like a really big thing right now, because like all this production and like all the semiconductors, chips, it has like a really big like environmental impact. And as there have been a lot of efforts to make sure that we bring sustainable for the future, I think that there definitely is going to be an increased focus on like how do you make these chips, how do you make it like more sustainably, how do you like use them more sustainably. And I don't think it's only like environmental sustainability, not only like how do we go green, carbon neutral, etc. But I think like when you talk about sustainability, there's also like the additional aspect of like equality and like using it for good, things like that. So I think there definitely will be like increased additional fields in that sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that has been like stated. And another industry that I feel like could potentially like really impact from this, like the growth of the semiconductor, and it could be correspondent to this growth for the semiconductor industry too. But crypto mining is definitely related to using CPUs and GPUs to like keep growing the cryptocurrency. Obviously, crypto recently had a few major controversies, but still at the end of the day, it's still like in the if you like compare everything like the technology spectrum, it's still kind of new and it's still like it's very like up and down, like you never know, but still it's growing and a lot of people are taking interest into it. So definitely crypto and the GPU and CPU trend can be like aligned. Also, just bouncing off of Jackie's point, like the sustainability, like right now, like we have like major like producing of CPUs, GPUs, and all different sorts of chips right now. But however, the environmental, like the sustainability option of that is still like it's still somewhat of a like a problem with in terms of like production. So definitely see more like adjacent fields so relating to the supply chain of producing these chips, and we will definitely see those developments also grow in alliance with the semiconductor and chip industry growth. And transitioning to my next question, what are some of the issues that could arise that relate to the semiconductor slash chip industry, and what are some issues that could potentially plague specific companies in this industry?
So some recent news actually came up with the semiconductor industry as in the past week, actually, the semiconductor industry, like the stocks of many major semiconductor companies and chip producers actually decreased. Is because of this so-called rumor that the TSMC are halting shipments of chips to many of their major customers. And we talked about TSMC a lot last time we discussed about Nvidia, is because Nvidia is a major customer of TSMC. But TSMC is not the only. They don't only have Nvidia as a customer. They have basically a large customer base all over the technology industry and high tech industry. And if TSMC is impacted, then basically the entire industry is also impacted. And this is also very important when we talk about the trade war between US and China, which has these two technology giants with both sides having a lot of money invested into their specific industries, and they're having each having large technology, like one's trying to outwit the other constantly, and this trade war going on definitely puts TSMC in the middle of the crosshairs. And even without TSMC in the crosshairs, each country is trying to one up the other, or maybe like try to push that other one down while they're pushing themselves up, and that will just heavily impact semiconductor and chip industry, which is what we're kind of seeing right now. And actually, some projections show that for 2023 there might be a dip in this industry due to these effects, but after 2023 there seems to be much hope that the industry will rebound from this dip.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also want to point out like I think we've talked about this before, but like the geopolitical tensions kind of between the United States and China, this really affects the semiconductor industry, especially because TSMC is such a major player. That's how NVIDIA gets a lot of their chips from. And I just think that that's a large part of like they may be facing restrictions and tariffs, and there's just a lot of stuff that's going on that these companies can't necessarily control. And in addition to that, like during the pandemic, we all knew there was like a big global chip storage, and that affected so many different companies. It just like, and different industries as well, like electronics, cars. It was caused by a combination of factors. And knowing that this type of thing has happened before, there's also the possibility that with a global pandemic or something else, it could definitely happen again. And I just think that these are some issues that make this industry kind of risky to kind of invest in. That's why it's also high growth, but it's also one of the in my opinion, one of the riskier industries to get in as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And mostly with Kaiwen's last point of like it's lucrative, but also like it's risky because it's not just like can you run your company? You also have to like think of like other factors that are just much bigger, like geopolitics and things like that, international relations. And then another thing I wanted to bring up with like the potential mishaps of the growth of the semiconductor industry is that on the side, like AI is like very interconnected with the whole like semiconductor industry. And so if you're using chips, then obviously you have to like think about that purpose. And I know this has been like a really big topic, but we all know that AI, like while it's been super, super helpful to like a lot of things and like a lot of things are being able to like be automated. You don't have to like, for example, put in so much work. You can have something else do it for you, but there's also like a big downside to it. For example, like bias and discrimination, for example, like even if your AI technically is like neutral in code, you still might have like bias in the results because of the data was biased or things like that. So like there might be like an increase in bias, and then some other things like there's security threats, like privacy issues, like cyber attacks, things like that. And like that's not just like AI, but just like with this growth of technology in general. But like that growth in technology is also really related to semiconductors and chips. So yes, it's like going to be very lucrative and things like that, but also there's like other negatives to take into account.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I have some other points to add myself. Um, Talking about the geopolitical relations between the United States and China, I'd also like to point out that in addition to like TSMC based in Taiwan, and they're like right in the middle of the tensions, there are also several semiconductor companies that actually produce and manufacture in China. For example, Intel has been manufacturing in China for a very long time, and due to these tensions and partly due to the pandemic as well, Intel's dominance in the CPU market has kind of decreased because they haven't been able to, obviously during that time they haven't been able to export back to the United States. And also like during the tensions, they obviously have to deal with tariffs, which means additional costs, and they haven't been as effective in exporting back. And that applies to like a lot of like different competitors of Intel that are also like based in America and want to like produce. We can definitely see that these like tensions, geopolitical tensions, are starting to become a problem. And also on the point of Intel and like Nvidia, some of these companies have a pretty significant market domination of both CPUs and GPUs. Obviously, last week we specialized in talking about Nvidia and their specialization with GPUs, but we also have a more general market domination in CPUs with Intel, AMD, Samsung. They're all like major players, and it's hard for small players to get in on this market, even though it is like risky and lucrative. And there's already some sort of control established in the market, and could potentially do harm to some companies that aren't able to keep up with this like level of competition, with this level of growth, and also to like newer companies that are wanting to experiment with like new things. And lastly, obviously we know that some of the semiconductor companies have decided to expand past just producing semiconductors. We obviously have some semiconductor companies that still specialize in producing semiconductors alone, like TSMC. Do you guys think that it is a feasible business strategy to expand past semiconductors, and why?
Yeah, as just like Jack mentioned, there's the semiconductor industry. Some have decided, you know, are set in producing semiconductors, while others are actually looking to expand past semiconductors. And you know, as what we previously mentioned, such as like, China and US companies. Like China, you have companies like Huawei, and US you have like Intel, AMD, Nvidia, companies like that. And then each, are not necessarily like, they don't necessarily produce only semiconductors. And particularly in this case, like Huawei, they produce phones, they produce laptops, but they also manage the cellular network. They're a major player in the 5G network provider. And like I think like 2 years ago or a year ago, they were like, when the geopolitical things happened, um Huawei were kicked out basically of the US because they dominated the 5G market so much. And so like other companies such as like Samsung, and then Samsung being a Korean company, and I think last time I checked, they contributed to around 20% of South Korea's GDP, which is a very big amount. And they are not only producing semiconductors either, they're producing other various technology products, and they are a major player in stuff like refrigerators, which is not necessarily related to um laptops and computers or like hard drives and SSDs. And addressing the question of whether or not it's a feasible business strategy is definitely is, because the semiconductor industry is getting more and more, saturated with more, I guess, producers coming in the market basically frequently. Not that frequently, but pretty frequently. And you know, it's a viable opportunity to expand your business by not staying within the same market, but expanding to other somewhat similar markets, which is what these large companies with a lot of money are doing. It's just like Samsung, Intel, AMD, Huawei. Companies like this who have a large, they have a lot of room to play with. They're expanding into markets. But another thing is like there's a lot of risks expanding into markets that are probably generally, hard to combat. And that's a major obstacle towards companies that are looking to expand past semiconductors, while also adding on to that problem is some talent shortages. So basically, what's happening right now with the chip shortages, they can't keep up with this chip shortages, or the semiconductor, they can't have enough talent to produce these technologies. Then these companies such as TSMC, they can't really afford to expand into another area, more market, and that seems to have backfired as they wanted to expand to Arizona, into the US, but it didn't happen, or it's paused right now. And something like risks like those prevent a lot of these companies from expanding.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in terms of companies that want to expand, it has to like depend on like how big this company is and like its position in the market. Of course, I know some companies that expanded notably, like Samsung, like we've said, and then also another few names are like the big names are Intel and Nvidia, but also Qualcomm and Texas Instruments as well. Like Qualcomm, they make like mobile processors, and they also kind of expanded to autonomous vehicles and also like 5G and Wi-Fi stuff. So in terms of expanding, I just think that whether or not it is a feasible business strategy, it obviously depends on the company, but I do think there's room in the industry for these companies to kind of grow in a way. And there's definitely a lot of competition right now, but I think that because of the nature of the semiconductor industry, there's definitely room for these companies to kind of grow and take hold of a market share.
Yeah, I also definitely agree with all that's being said, but to Jack's like I guess original question of like is it a feasible business strategy to I guess like be in this industry and like grow in this industry? I think like definitely. And just to like reiterate Kaiwen's point, like obviously that's not like a guarantee. Like just because you exist in the industry doesn't mean you're gonna do well. Like if you manage your business well, like there is potential to succeed. I think that's like the thing we're saying. But I think like to look at this kind of adjacently is also like like original, I guess, semiconductor companies are like expanding into other like pathways. But on the flip side, like companies who didn't really start off in this industry are like going into it. Like Apple, like you don't when you hear Apple, you're not like, oh yes, my favorite semiconductor industry. Like that's not what you think. But they have started making like their own silicon chips, like they've kind of started doing all of this. And then like other companies as well, like they're making their own like chips for their products. And so I think like if it wasn't a feasible thing for the business to do, they wouldn't have done it. Like if this industry wasn't as lucrative as it is, like these top companies wouldn't have started doing it. And I think like because it's not just like one, it's not just Apple, right? Like a few other companies have. And I think like that kind of also just shows the strength behind this market and kind of like the faith almost that stems from the necessity, right? Like you can't really have a computer, you can't really have a phone that works as well as it does without a chip. Like that just kind of doesn't really exist. So, and also like within the foreseeable future, I think it's like pretty important too. So like this industry like will keep on expanding because we just can't really like leave the products that they're used for anymore. And like every year like we see like new technologies pop up, like ChatGPT, like AI, like Gen AI is only like technically a form of AI, but like that's kind of the one where people see the most, like what they think of now when they hear AI. Like if you asked me like 2 years ago what ChatGPT is, I'd be like, I have no idea. And I think most people would also say that. And so like every like year and like as time goes on, this industry is only growing. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that like technology and like these chips are like, I think they're like really close to each other, especially several like fields. Like chips provide like TVs, phones. So definitely if you could produce a chip, maybe you could go into like producing like a phone or something like that. So it's definitely feasible, especially with increased competition coming in. Not only these like new companies that are producing these chips, but also like new old established big like technology giants that are just expanding into the semiconductor industry because it's so lucrative. Like you, if you want to like stand out, then potentially you may need to like expand further just to like also get some like revenue in case like the competition starts to heat up, you may get a little bit like less revenue. So it's definitely a workable business, feasible business strategy. I would say that again, also according to Ivan's point, potentially like if you want to expand into something like TSMC is doing in Arizona, obviously it's on hold right now because of some issues. Like you need to make sure you have the labor, you have the money to do it. And definitely if you do, then it could be like feasible. It is risky, but you need to make sure you have enough funds to like handle the risk in case it does backfire. But and but if you don't, then probably I would I would suggest to keep like keep participating in just like an industry before you get money and then you can expand elsewhere. So thank you for tuning in to our episode about the semiconductor slash chip industry, where we talked about more of the semiconductor and chip industry in general, aside from just NVIDIA in the prior episode. I'm your host, Jack, and stay tuned for next week's episode.